Here we are in Hanoi, Vietnam, where over 7 million people live. Today we're going to talk about density and distribution. I'm Mr. Coulter, and this is Human Geography. Last time, in topic 2.1, we talked about population distribution. But this time, as we move into topic 2.2, we're going to talk about the consequences of where people are located around the Earth, and why when they gather in certain places, that affects other places and the people who live there. So let's go back to a cartogram that we haven't seen before about the population distribution of the world. This one shows proportional squares of the population of each of these places. Again, we're reminded that Asia has the majority of the world's people. And in this cartogram, helps us to see the biggest countries in each of the regions. So we can point out that Indonesia and Pakistan are very large, that the United States, Brazil, Russia, and Nigeria are each the respective biggest countries in terms of population in each of those regions. So let's look at how that distribution affects people in the places where they live. The first we're going to look at are political consequences. So many people living in one area can change the political power of those areas. So an example of this is some megacities have the majority of votes for a state or a country. So if we see really large cities forming, they can have over-influence over all the rural areas of their states or countries. So let's look at New York. The majority of New York State's population, which is 19.5 million, live in New York City or the suburbs. So you can imagine that if you live in northern New York or upstate New York, you probably have a lot less political power or representation than the people who live in New York City. So the things that the city want end up happening more often than the people in the rural parts of the state. That's why so often in the United States, we're aware of who the mayor is just as much as the governor of New York. This example holds true for countries too. If you have a primate city, which we'll learn about in Unit 6, urbanization, a city that is so much larger than all the other cities in the country, like Tokyo, you can see that that city has so much political representation in the country. The metro area of Tokyo is about a third of Japan's 126.5 million people. So you can imagine that the city of Tokyo has a lot of political representation in Japan. In some cases, being in a populated area gets you more political power, and in others, it limits it. So an example in the United States is the Electoral College. Sometimes if you live in a state with less people, your vote actually counts for more in the Electoral College or in the Senate, where each state gets 2 representatives. So if you're a voter in Wisconsin, that means your vote in the Electoral College counts as more than someone in Florida. A study did a comparison of how much each state's electoral vote counts, and someone in Wisconsin's vote counts 3 times as much in the Electoral College as someone from Florida. So that's one way that where you're distributed affects politics. Another way that people living in different places affect society is economic consequences. So there are many economic consequences of people gathering in one place. As people gather in dense cities, we often see many jobs created to support those people, and that draws more people in. So when people choose to migrate, they choose to migrate to these cities that are known for a lot of jobs. But the problem that can come from that is that when so many people move, there aren't enough job opportunities to go around, and we see a lot of people moving into big cities or dense areas without work and then are unable to support themselves. So in South American megacities, we see millions and millions of people moving to these large cities and then building like squatter settlements, like a favela in Brazil. Like in the coastal cities of Brazil, we see favelas where people just build up their own towns and homes, and they don't have the work to support it because they know that their life will still be better in the slums of those cities than it would be in rural areas without any resources. So that's one example of where we have a major economic consequence of people moving to dense areas. Another is that dense areas become extremely expensive to live in. So people who have lived in cities for generations and had work that was either middle class or lower class are unable to continue to afford to live in those cities. They're pushed out of the cities. In New York and London, 2 of the most expensive housing markets in the world, people who have the jobs to support the people who live there, can no longer live in that area, which creates a long commute for them. And with more people going to these dense areas for new work, we see economic decline in the areas they're leaving, like rural areas or the older cities that have industries that have shut down. A good example of industries that have shut down is the Rust Belt in the United States. That's the region of the United States that used to house the automobile industry. Around the 1900s start, there was a booming automotive industry in the American Northeast, around Michigan, Detroit, and those regions. But as those factory jobs have left the country and people have started moving to other areas, we see rust forming on the factories, why it's called the Rust Belt. And then the economic situation in those areas is very poor. So when people leave areas, it has economic consequences as well. So the next are social consequences. So those are the things that people have access to. So people in dense areas often have access to better education. So even in cities where we see a lot of people, the education is still often better than in rural areas. An example of this, Georgia, the average SAT score in the 5 biggest counties is a 1093 versus the 5 smallest counties, which is 940. So we see about 150-point difference between small rural counties and then the biggest counties in Georgia. And that's not even getting into private school counties or specific city areas where those cities have their own school system. Larger cities often also have more specialized medicine, so more options when you have specific things that you need to take care of. An example of this is people in New York City have the option of 63 hospitals with all sorts of different specialties, but the entire northern third of their state has less than 20 hospitals that they can go to. So if you're in a dense area, you typically have more options in terms of medicine. Also, we see in rural areas a number that we're going to learn about later in this unit, the infant mortality rate, which is a very sad number, but it helps us understand the medical care for a community. In rural areas, the infant mortality rate is typically higher than in dense areas. So we're going to look at a chart in 1 second of the infant mortality rate, and we see that in India, it's 30 to 40% higher in rural areas than it is in urban areas. So like I said, education. In Georgia, you can see that you need an average 1350 SAT score to get into the University of Georgia, and you're more likely to get that in urban areas, rural or suburban areas, school district, than in a rural area. And then in India, we see the trend of the infant mortality rate dropping over time, but still, even as it drops, there's a major gap between the rural areas and the urban areas in India and the number of children that don't make it to 1 year old. There's also environmental consequences of people living in densely populated areas. Densely populated areas are much more harmful to the environment than rural areas are due to all the automobiles, trash creation, and building energy consumption. So we know that cities in densely populated areas or suburbs where people drive a lot into work create a lot more environmental consequences than people who live in rural areas. So this is a map of the United States with landfills. And we can see if we looked at a density chart of the United States, it would be pretty close to where people are creating waste. So along the East Coast, the Northeast, Texas, and then California, we see a lot of waste created. We also see a map of air pollution, similar trends. So we see around the Great Lakes region, where we see a lot of factories. We see in the Southeast around Atlanta and Birmingham. We see in the Northeast around New York City and the surrounding cities. And then in Southern California, where there's a lot of production, along with Texas. So again, if we looked at a density map of the United States, it would look pretty similar to the air pollution in the landfill map. And that brings us to carrying capacity, which is what we're going to look at when we talk about overpopulation. Carrying capacity is the ability of the land to sustain a certain number of people. So we look at the land and we say, what resources are there? And can the land support the people that live there? If we exceed that carrying capacity, if we have too many people, we risk overpopulation. And that would be a lack of necessary resources to meet the needs of the population of a defined area. So if we exceed carrying capacity, that means we don't have enough resources, and then either people go hungry or they don't have enough to survive. So that is carrying capacity, which is the ability of the land to sustain a certain number of people. So today in topic 2.2, we talked about the consequences of where people live. And we're going to continue to delve into where people live and how that affects the people who live there, and also the kind of political, economic, and social representation around the world. Don't forget that carrying capacity is the number of people that can be healthily sustained in an area, and that overpopulation is when we go over those numbers and are no longer able to take care of the people that live here. So that was just one more step in our journey to better understanding our world. I'm Mr. Coulter, and that was Human Geography.